A morning of mixed emotions. Maya Henderson's morning began in a whirlwind of emotions. Her alarm clock buzzed relentlessly at 4:30 a.m., piercing the stillness of her modest Brooklyn apartment. She groaned, reaching out blindly to silence the alarm before dragging herself out of bed. Today wasn't just another early start for work. It was a day she had dreaded for years, a day she couldn't avoid any longer. The pale light of dawn filtered through her blinds as Maya padded barefoot to the kitchen. She brewed a cup of strong black coffee, leaning against the counter as the scent filled the air. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the first sip. She glanced at the calendar pinned to her fridge. The date glared back at her, a stark reminder of what lay ahead. It wasn't the usual grueling FBI assignment or a high-stakes operation. It was a trip home, a journey back to the South, where unresolved pain and familial tension awaited her like storm clouds on the horizon. Her mother was gravely ill, and Maya had finally run out of excuses to stay away. She had rehearsed this trip in her mind countless times. What would she say? How would her mother react? Would there be forgiveness, or would the chasm between them remain? The questions buzzed in her head like persistent flies, refusing to be swatted away. Maya walked over to her closet, pulling out a well-worn suitcase that had seen countless work trips, but never one this personal. The edges were frayed, the zipper slightly stiff, but it was reliable, a stark contrast to the uncertainty she felt about the journey ahead. As she began packing, her fingers brushed over a framed photo tucked in the corner of the closet. It was a picture of her and her mother from years ago, both beaming with joy at her high school graduation. She hesitated, her hand lingering on the frame. The memory was bittersweet. Her mother had been her biggest cheerleader back then, always pushing her to aim high. But when Maya had decided to join the FBI, that support had vanished. Her mother's words from that fateful argument echoed in her mind. "You're joining them. The very people who oppress us. How could you, Maya?" No matter how much Maya had tried to explain her motivations, to enact change from within, to fight for justice in a broken system, her mother had refused to listen. The rift between them had only deepened over the years, and Maya had buried herself in her work to avoid confronting it. The shrill ring of her phone jolted her back to the present. She glanced at the screen and saw her brother Chris's name. Bracing herself, she answered. "Hey, Chris," she said, her voice tentative. "Maya." Chris's voice was heavy, each word a struggle. "Mom's not doing well. The doctors. They don't think she has much time." The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the bed to steady herself, her mind racing. She had known her mother was sick, but hearing it put so bluntly made the reality inescapable. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't the time to fall apart. "I'm on my way," Maya said, her voice steadier than she felt. Chris hesitated. "She'll be glad to see you," he said, though the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. Maya hung up and stared at her packed suitcase. A part of her wanted to unpack, to curl back into bed and pretend none of this was happening. But she had never been one to back down from a challenge, no matter how personal or painful. She squared her shoulders, drawing on the strength that had carried her through countless difficult moments in her career. If she could face armed criminals and high-stakes negotiations, she could face this. Her mother deserved that much. By the time she arrived at the airport, the world outside was bathed in the pale gray of early morning. The bustling terminal was alive with the sounds of announcements, the clatter of luggage, and the hum of conversations. Maya moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, her FBI training kicking in as she navigated the familiar rituals of airport security. She placed her shoes and belongings in a plastic bin, her movements methodical. As she passed through the metal detector, her mind was far away, replaying fragments of old arguments and unresolved grievances. When she reached the other side, she collected her items and made her way to the check-in counter. A young attendant with a bright smile greeted her. "Good morning, Miss Henderson." "First class, I see. Let me get you checked in." Maya nodded, grateful for the professional politeness. It was a small relief in an otherwise heavy day. The attendant handed her the boarding pass with a warm smile. "Have a pleasant flight." "Thank you," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. She found a seat near her gate, clutching her boarding pass like a lifeline. Around her, travelers chatted, laughed, and scrolled through their phones. But Maya felt isolated, as though the weight of her thoughts had created a bubble around her. She tried to focus on the logistics of the trip, her connecting flight, the rental car, but her mind kept drifting back to her mother. Would her mother be happy to see her? Would she even recognize her after all these years? The uncertainty gnawed at her, making the minutes drag on. When her boarding group was called, Maya stood and joined the first-class line. Her movements were measured, purposeful, a mask of calm hiding the turmoil within. As she approached the gate agent, an uneasy feeling crept over her, but she pushed it aside. She had traveled countless times without issue. This would be no different, or so she thought. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a thin-lipped smile, glanced at Maya's casual attire and carry-on bag. Her eyes lingered, and her expression hardened. "This is the first-class line," the agent said, her tone icy. The words hung in the air, heavy with judgment. Maya froze, the sting of prejudice hitting her like a slap. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself of who she was and what she had accomplished. She wasn't just any traveler. She was Special Agent Maya Henderson, and she had earned her place here. "Yes, I'm aware," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. She handed over her boarding pass, her gaze unwavering. The agent took the ticket and scrutinized it as though searching for a flaw. Seconds ticked by, each one amplifying the tension. Finally, the agent looked up, her eyes filled with suspicion. "There must be a mistake," she declared loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Maya's chest tightened as the agent waved over a security officer. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Maya could feel the weight of their stares. Her hands clenched at her sides as she braced herself for yet another moment where she would have to prove her worth. Little did the agent know, Maya was about to show them exactly who she was, and in doing so, she would transform this moment of humiliation into a powerful statement about dignity and resilience. The badge that changed everything. The atmosphere around the boarding gate grew tense as the security officer approached. He was a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. The whispers from the surrounding passengers had grown into a low murmur, a cacophony of judgment and curiosity. Maya Henderson stood her ground, her posture tall and her expression impassive, though her heart pounded in her chest. The gate agent leaned toward the officer, her voice a hushed murmur as she explained her supposed concerns. Maya couldn't make out her words, but the furtive glances in her direction and the way the agent gestured at her ticket and carry-on bag told her everything she needed to know. It wasn't the first time she had been judged by appearances alone, and sadly, she knew it wouldn't be the last. The security officer turned his attention to Maya. His eyes flickered briefly with hesitation before settling into a neutral gaze. "Ma'am," he began, his tone professional but firm, "we need to verify some details before you can board." Maya's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Years of FBI training had taught her how to handle confrontations like this with grace. This wasn't a time for anger, though the temptation was there. Instead, she reached into her bag, retrieving her ID with steady hands. "Here's my ID," she said, her voice calm but tinged with quiet authority. The officer took the card, his brows furrowing slightly as he examined it. It wasn't the reaction Maya had anticipated. Instead of immediately handing it back, he scrutinized it for longer than necessary. Her patience, honed by years in the field, was beginning to wear thin. The weight of the stares from the passengers behind her felt like a physical burden, pressing on her back. After what felt like an eternity, the officer handed back her ID. "This is valid," he admitted, though his tone lacked conviction. He turned to the gate agent, who still seemed unconvinced. "Ma'am, There doesn't appear to be an issue. The gate agent pursed her lips, clearly dissatisfied with his conclusion. Well, if everything's in order, she can proceed, the agent said stiffly, her tone suggesting she still believed there was some mistake. Maya had had enough. With deliberate movements, she reached into her bag again, this time pulling out her FBI badge. The polished metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the sight of it seemed to freeze the scene around her. Maya held it up for both the gate agent and the security officer to see, her fingers steady on the leather case. "I'm Special Agent Maya Henderson with the FBI," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Each word carried the weight of her accomplishments and the injustice she felt in this moment. This badge should erase any doubts about my identity. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The gate agent's face drained of color, her haughty demeanor crumbling into one of shock and embarrassment. The security officer straightened, his professional facade faltering as he muttered, I wasn't aware, Mom." Maya's gaze swept over them, her composure unshaken. "You weren't aware because you assumed," she said, her tone measured but pointed. "Assumed I didn't belong in first class. Assumed I wasn't worth the respect or courtesy every passenger deserves." The silence around the gate was deafening. Passengers who had been blatantly watching the scene now averted their gazes, suddenly finding their phones or the floor incredibly interesting. A few murmured awkward apologies under their breath, but Maya paid them no mind. She wasn't here to placate them. She was here to make a point. The gate agent stammered, her words a tangle of excuses and apologies. I'm so sorry, Agent Henderson. I didn't mean to." "You did mean to," Maya interrupted, her voice cutting through the agent's feeble attempts at damage control. "Your actions were deliberate, and they were rooted in prejudice. You saw my face, my skin, my clothes, and you made a judgment about who I was and what I could afford. You didn't even consider the possibility that I could belong here." The gate agent's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no coherent response came. The security officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting his involvement. Maya's badge still glinted in her hand, a symbol of her hard work and dedication. "This badge doesn't just represent my role as an FBI agent," she continued, her voice steady but firm. "It represents the countless barriers I've overcome to get here. Barriers that you, and people like you, put in my way." The agent looked as though she wanted to shrink into the floor. "I'm truly sorry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Maya's expression softened, but only slightly. "I accept your apology," she said, though her tone left no room for misunderstanding. "But remember this moment. Remember that your assumptions and biases affect real people. And next time, think twice before you act on them." The gate agent nodded, her face flushed with shame. The security officer mumbled another apology before stepping back, clearly eager to extricate himself from the situation. Maya returned her badge to her bag and adjusted her carry-on. The passengers in line parted for her as she walked toward the boarding tunnel, their eyes lingering on her with a mix of awe and discomfort. She could feel the weight of their silent admiration and guilt, but she kept her focus forward. As she settled into her first-class seat, Maya allowed herself a moment to exhale. The confrontation had drained her more than she expected, but it had also reminded her of something important: her strength, her resilience, and her purpose. She wasn't just traveling home as a daughter trying to mend a broken relationship. She was traveling as a woman who had fought for every inch of her success. Maya's thoughts turned to her mother. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope that they could bridge the gap between them. Perhaps through her actions and her achievements, she could show her mother that the fight for justice was worth it. That change was possible, even in a flawed system. The flight attendant approached her seat, offering a warm smile. "Is there anything I can get you, Agent Henderson?" Maya smiled faintly. "Just some water. Thank you." As the plane taxied down the runway, Maya gazed out the window, her mind racing. This journey was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. For her mother, For herself, and for the countless others who faced similar challenges every day, she would continue to fight. The plane lifted into the sky, carrying Maya toward a confrontation she could no longer avoid, and perhaps a resolution she desperately needed. Rising above assumptions. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Maya allowed herself a moment to reflect. Her heart still pounded from the confrontation at the gate, but now that she was seated and away from prying eyes, a new wave of emotions surged through her. Anger and frustration warred with a deep-seated sadness, a sadness that had been planted long ago, growing in the shadows of every prejudice and slight she'd endured throughout her life. The flight attendant returned with a glass of water, her demeanor polite but tinged with hesitation. "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask," the attendant said softly, her eyes lingering on Maya for a moment longer than necessary before she walked away. Maya took a sip of water, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. She closed her eyes, letting the low hum of the engines and the soft murmurs of passengers around her fill the silence. But her mind wouldn't rest. It replayed the gate agent's condescending tone, the furtive glances from other passengers, and the way she'd been reduced to a spectacle. Her fingers brushed the leather case of her FBI badge, still tucked safely in her bag. That badge was a symbol of everything she had worked for, every barrier she had shattered. It was her shield, her proof of worth in a world that often refused to see it. And yet, even that badge hadn't protected her from judgment today. How many others faced this every day without a badge to shield them? The thought lingered in her mind, heavy and unshakable. Maya knew she was one of the lucky ones, not because she was immune to prejudice, but because she had the tools and the platform to fight back. Others weren't so fortunate. Her phone buzzed in her lap, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Chris. "Just landed. I'll pick you up when you get here. Mom's asking about you." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected her mother to be awake, let alone asking for her. A swirl of emotions rose within her: hope, fear, and the undeniable pull of guilt. Her relationship with her mother had been strained for so long, each argument leaving deeper wounds. Would her mother still see her as the daughter who had betrayed their community, or would she see the woman Maya had become, the fighter, the advocate, the protector? Maya's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion a few rows ahead. A passenger, an older white man in a pressed suit, was arguing with a flight attendant. His voice was loud, his tone entitled. "I don't care about the policy," he barked. "I'm not moving my bag for anyone." Maya watched as the flight attendant, a young woman barely in her 20s, tried to calm the man down. Her voice was steady, but Maya could see the tension in her shoulders, the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. She had seen that look before, in colleagues, in civilians, and even in herself. It was the look of someone trying to maintain composure while being belittled. Without thinking, Maya unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The other passengers in the first-class cabin glanced her way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Is there a problem here?" Maya asked, her voice calm but authoritative. The man turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, clearly unimpressed by her interruption. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out her badge, flipping it open with practiced ease. "Special Agent Maya Henderson, FBI," she said, her tone cool and professional. "Is there an issue with following airline policy?" The man's face paled, his bluster deflating in an instant. "I didn't realize," he stammered, his earlier bravado replaced by sheepishness. "Good," Maya replied, her gaze steady. "Then I'm sure you'll have no problem complying with the flight attendant's request." The man muttered something under his breath, but ultimately complied, moving his bag as the flight attendant had asked. The young woman shot Maya a grateful look, her posture relaxing slightly as she stepped back to continue her work. Maya returned to her seat, aware of the eyes that followed her as she moved through the cabin. Some passengers looked impressed, others seemed uneasy. Maya didn't care. She wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to do what was right, regardless of who was watching. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, but Maya's thoughts remained restless. She couldn't stop thinking about the interactions she'd just experienced, both at the gate and on the plane. They were microcosms of a larger problem, one she had dedicated her life to addressing but could never truly escape from. As the plane began its descent, Maya stared out the window at the patchwork of fields and towns below. The South always looked beautiful from above, its rolling landscapes a stark contrast to the complicated emotions it stirred within her. This was home, yet it wasn't. It was where she had grown up, but also where she had faced some of her earliest battles with prejudice and identity. The plane touched down smoothly, and Maya felt her heart rate spike as the wheels hit the tarmac. The journey was far from over. She still had to face her mother, her past, and the unresolved pain that had been festering for years. As the passengers disembarked, Maya waited for the aisle to clear before grabbing her bag and stepping into the aisle. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the metal floor as she exited the plane and entered the bustling terminal. Chris was waiting for her near baggage claim, his tall frame and easy smile a comforting sight amid the chaos of the airport. He waved as she approached, his expression shifting to concern as he took in her tired face. "Hey, sis," he said, pulling her into a quick hug. "You okay?" Maya nodded, though she wasn't sure it was entirely true. "Long day," she said simply. Chris studied her for a moment before nodding. "Come on. Mom's at the house. Well, you'll see." The drive to their childhood home was quiet, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Maya stared out the window, her mind racing with memories and fears. The confrontation at the airport felt like a distant echo now, overshadowed by the looming reality of seeing her mother again. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Maya felt her breath catch. The house looked smaller than she remembered, its once vibrant exterior now faded with age. The porch light flickered, casting a dim glow over the worn steps. Chris placed a hand on her shoulder. "You ready?" Maya swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "Not really," she admitted, "but I'm here." As they walked up the steps, the door opened slowly, and there she was, her mother, frail but still standing, her eyes filled with an emotion Maya couldn't quite decipher. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, her mother's voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. Maya. It was just her name, but it carried years of unspoken words, pain, and love. Maya stepped forward, her throat tight with emotion. "Hi, Mom." The gap between them, both physical and emotional, had never felt so wide. But as her mother opened her arms, the first fragile bridge began to form. Maya stepped into the embrace, the weight of the past momentarily lifting as she held on to the hope of healing. This was just the beginning, but for the first time in years, it felt like a step in the right direction. The weight of reconciliation. The hug was tentative at first, like two strangers finding their way back to something long lost. Maya's arms wrapped around her mother, and she could feel the frailty in her once strong frame. Her mother, Margaret Henderson, had always been a formidable woman, a teacher, a community leader, and a fighter for justice in every sense of the word. Now she felt like a shadow of her former self, her strength diminished by illness, but her presence no less commanding. When they pulled apart, Margaret's sharp eyes studied Maya, taking in every detail. "You've changed," she said, her voice soft, but laced with the same discerning edge Maya had grown up with. Maya managed a small smile. "So have you, Mom." Margaret gave a dry chuckle and gestured toward the door. "Come inside. We have a lot to talk about." The house smelled like it always had, a mixture of lavender, fresh linen, and the faint aroma of whatever Chris had been cooking in the kitchen. Maya stepped into the living room, her eyes immediately drawn to the familiar details. The same floral couch, the photos lining the mantel, the worn carpet she and Chris had played on as kids. It was as if time had stood still in this house, even as the world outside changed. Margaret settled into her favorite armchair, her movements slow and deliberate. Chris excused himself to the kitchen, muttering something about checking on dinner, leaving Maya and Margaret alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken words. "So," Margaret began, her tone neutral but probing, "how's the big city life treating you?" Maya sat on the edge of the couch, her back straight. "It's busy. Work keeps me occupied." Margaret nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Work, the FBI." Maya felt her stomach tighten. The tension she had been bracing for was finally here. She leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "Mom, I know you don't agree with what I do. You've made that clear. But—" Margaret held up a hand, silencing her. "It's not about agreeing or disagreeing, Maya. It's about understanding. And for the longest time, I didn't understand why you would choose to be part of something that has hurt our people so deeply." The words were a knife to Maya's heart, but she didn't flinch. She had prepared for this conversation, knowing it was inevitable. "I chose the FBI because I wanted to make a difference, Mom. From the inside, I saw so many things wrong with the system, and I thought if I could be there, I could help fix it." Margaret's expression softened slightly, but her eyes still held a glint of skepticism. "And have you made a difference?" Maya hesitated, her mind racing through the countless cases she had worked on. She thought about the lives she had saved, the communities she had protected, and the criminals she had brought to justice. But she also thought about the battles she hadn't won, the systemic issues she couldn't change, and the moments of doubt that kept her awake at night. "I try," Maya said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every day I try." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "Trying is good, Maya. But sometimes it feels like the trying isn't enough. Not when there's so much brokenness. Not when so many are still hurting." The words stung, but Maya knew they weren't meant to wound. They were the words of a woman who had seen too much injustice, who had fought battles of her own, and carried the scars to prove it. "Mom," Maya said, her voice firmer now, "I'm not blind to the problems. I see them every day. I live them. But walking away wouldn't solve anything. Staying and fighting, even when it's hard, that's what makes a difference." Margaret studied her daughter, her expression unreadable. "You've always been stubborn," she said finally, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I suppose you get that from me." Maya chuckled despite herself. "Yeah, I think I do." Chris returned with plates of food, interrupting the heavy conversation. The smell of roasted chicken and collard greens filled the room, and for a moment, the tension eased. The three of them sat around the small dining table, sharing a meal that felt like a bridge between past and present. As they ate, Margaret shared stories of her life. Her work as a teacher, her memories of raising Maya and Chris, and her thoughts on the community she had dedicated her life to. Maya listened intently, soaking in every word. It had been so long since they had talked like this, and she realized how much she had missed it. After dinner, Chris excused himself to take a phone call, leaving Maya and Margaret alone again. The evening light cast a warm glow over the room, and the hum of cicadas drifted in through the open window. Margaret turned to Maya, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began, "I wasn't just angry when you joined the FBI. I was scared." Maya frowned. "Scared? Of what?" Margaret's voice wavered, a crack in her usual composure. "Scared for you, Maya. Scared of what could happen to you out there. Scared of the dangers you'd face, not just from the job, but from the people who might see you as a threat because of who you are." The admission hit Maya like a freight train. She had always assumed her mother's disapproval stemmed from ideological differences, from her belief that the FBI was part of the problem. But now she saw the truth. Her mother's anger had been rooted in fear, a fear born from love. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mom," Maya said softly. "I just wanted to make you proud." Margaret reached out, her frail hand resting on Maya's. "You have, Maya. You always have. I just didn't know how to show it." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Maya felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had feared would never come. "I love you, Mom," she said, her voice breaking. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening. "I love you too, baby." For the first time in years, Maya felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal and bridges to rebuild. But in this moment, with her mother's hand in hers, she felt hope. Hope that they could move forward together. The ties that bind. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Maya's childhood bedroom. She stirred awake, the familiar creak of the old twin bed beneath her bringing back a flood of memories. This was the room where she had spent countless nights studying under a dim desk lamp, dreaming of a future far from the confines of her small town. It felt both comforting and surreal to be back. Sitting up, Maya glanced around. The walls were still painted the soft lavender her mother had chosen when she was 12. Her trophies and ribbons from debate competitions and track meets were arranged neatly on a dusty shelf, untouched since she'd left for college. Even the faint smell of lavender from an old sachet in her dresser drawer lingered in the air. Yet everything seemed smaller now, as if her presence in the world had outgrown the space that once defined her. After a quick shower and a change into comfortable clothes, Maya ventured downstairs. The soft hum of gospel music greeted her, along with the faint aroma of coffee brewing. In the kitchen, Margaret was seated at the table, a steaming mug in her hand and a distant look in her eyes. The sight of her mother, fragile yet still so poised, stirred something deep within Maya, a mix of nostalgia and regret. "Morning, Mom," Maya said, her voice gentle. Margaret turned, her face brightening slightly. "Morning, Maya. Did you sleep well?" Maya nodded as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Yeah, better than I expected. Being back here, it's strange, but not in a bad way." Margaret smiled faintly. "This house holds a lot of memories. Some good, some not so good, but it's home." Maya sat across from her mother, the mug warming her hands. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the gospel tune playing softly in the background. It was Margaret who broke the quiet, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Do you remember that time you won the regional debate championship?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with the hint of a memory. Maya chuckled. "How could I forget? You were in the front row, cheering louder than anyone else. I think you scared half the audience." Margaret laughed, the sound light but genuine. "I was proud of you. Still am, you know." The words caught Maya off guard, but she didn't let it show. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." Margaret's expression turned serious. "But I wasn't always good at showing it, was I?" Maya hesitated, unsure how to respond. The truth was complicated, tangled in years of misunderstandings and unspoken hurt. "You showed it in your own way," she said finally, careful with her words. Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the table. "I wanted to protect you, Maya, from the world, from its harshness. But I think, in trying to protect you, I ended up pushing you away." Maya reached across the table, placing her hand over her mother's. "You did what you thought was best. I understand that now." Later that day, Chris suggested they visit the local community center where Margaret had spent much of her life organizing events and mentoring young people. It was a modest building with faded paint and a patchy lawn, but it held a vibrancy it couldn't be ignored. Children played outside, their laughter echoing through the air, while adults gathered in small groups, their conversations animated. Margaret seemed to come alive as they stepped inside. People greeted her warmly, their faces lighting up at the sight of her. Maya watched as her mother moved through the room with an ease that belied her frailty, exchanging hugs and handshakes, her presence commanding respect. "This is where the real work happens," Margaret said, turning to Maya with a smile. "Not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but here, in the heart of the community." Maya nodded, her respect for her mother deepening. "You've built something incredible here, Mom." Margaret's smile faltered, her gaze becoming wistful. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who believed in making this place better. But it's not enough, Maya. There's still so much to do." They spent the afternoon touring the center, meeting people whose lives Margaret had touched. A young woman approached them, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't know if you remember me," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But you helped me get my GED when I was about to give up. Because of you, I'm now in nursing school." Margaret beamed, her hand resting on the young woman's shoulder. "Of course I remember you, Jasmine. I always knew you could do it." Maya stood silently, observing the exchange. She felt a pang of guilt, realizing how little she knew about this side of her mother's life. While she had been chasing her own dreams, her mother had been quietly changing lives, one person at a time. That evening, back at the house, the three of them gathered in the living room. Chris had brought out an old photo album, and they flipped through the pages, laughing at the awkward hairstyles and outfits of years past. For the first time in a long time, the weight of tension between them seemed to lift, replaced by the warmth of shared memories. One photo caught Maya's attention. It was a picture of her mother at a protest, her fist raised high in defiance. She looked fierce and unyielding, a younger version of the woman who now sat beside her. "You were always a fighter," Maya said, her voice filled with admiration. Margaret chuckled. "I had to be. The world didn't give me much choice." Maya looked at her mother, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe we're more alike than I realized." Margaret's eyes softened. "I've always known that, Maya. I just didn't know how to tell you." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of healing and understanding. Maya leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was truly home, not just in a physical sense, but in her connection to her family. As the night wore on, Margaret grew tired, and Chris helped her upstairs to bed. Maya stayed behind, staring at the photo album in her lap. She traced her fingers over the images, her mind racing with thoughts of the past and hopes for the future. She knew there was still much to mend, but the foundation had been laid. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Maya felt ready to face it, with her family by her side. Reflections and reconciliations. The quiet of the night settled over the Henderson home, the sounds of cicadas humming softly through the open windows. Maya remained in the living room, the photo album still resting on her lap. Each image was a portal to a different time, one filled with moments of joy, struggle, and growth. She lingered on a picture of herself as a child, grinning broadly as she held up a trophy from her first track meet. Her mother stood behind her in the photo, her hands on Maya's shoulders, her expression one of boundless pride. The weight of the day hung heavily on her, but it wasn't just fatigue. It was the emotional toll of confronting the fractured relationship with her mother. Margaret's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "I was scared for you." Maya had never fully considered the depth of her mother's fears. Growing up, she had seen Margaret as unshakable, a pillar of strength who fought for others without hesitation. But beneath that strength had been a mother's vulnerability, one that Maya was only now beginning to understand. She closed the album gently, setting it aside as she rose to her feet. The house felt different now, not just because of the years that had passed, but because of the new perspective she carried. The walls no longer seemed as confining. Instead, they felt like witnesses to a shared history she could finally embrace. Maya walked into the kitchen, drawn by the soft light of the overhead fixture. Chris was there, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression thoughtful. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low. Maya shook her head, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "Too much on my mind." Chris joined her, setting his glass on the table as he sat down. "It's been a lot, huh? Coming back, seeing Mom like this." "It's more than that," Maya admitted. "It's realizing how much I didn't see before, how much I didn't understand about her." Chris nodded, his gaze distant. "She's always been tough on us, but it's because she wanted us to be stronger than the world that tried to break her. I think she never really learned how to let go of that fight." Maya leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. "She was fighting for us, even when we didn't realize it, but it made me feel like I could never measure up, like I was always disappointing her." Chris reached out, placing a hand on hers. "You didn't disappoint her, Maya. She just didn't know how to show her pride. But trust me, she's proud. She always has been." Maya sighed, her heart heavy with regret. "I wish I'd understood that sooner." "You're here now," Chris said gently. "That's what matters." The next morning, Maya woke early, the light of dawn casting a soft glow through her bedroom window. She dressed quickly and headed downstairs, finding her mother already awake and seated in the living room. Margaret was wrapped in a shawl, a steaming cup of tea in her hands as she stared out the window. "Morning, Mom," Maya said, taking the seat beside her. Margaret turned to her with a small smile. "Morning, baby. Couldn't sleep again?" "Not really," Maya admitted. "Too much on my mind." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot too. About us. About everything." Maya shifted in her seat, the tension between them palpable but not unbearable. "Me too," she said softly. "I've been thinking about how much you've done. For the community, for us. And I realize now that I didn't appreciate it as much as I should have." Margaret reached out, placing a frail hand on Maya's. "You've always appreciated it, Maya. You just showed it in your own way. And I didn't always see that. I was so focused on the bigger picture, on the fights I thought mattered most, that I forgot to see the fights you were winning." Maya blinked back tears, her throat tight. "I just wanted you to be proud of me, Mom." Margaret's eyes glistened, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am proud of you, Maya. I've always been proud of you. Even when I didn't say it, even when I didn't show it the way I should have, I was proud." The words broke through the walls Maya had built around her heart. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned forward, pulling her mother into a gentle embrace. Margaret held her tightly, her own tears dampening Maya's shoulder. For the first time in years, the tension between them dissolved, replaced by an unspoken understanding. The years of distance and misunderstanding didn't vanish, but they no longer felt insurmountable. In that moment, they were simply a mother and daughter, bound by love and the hope of healing. Later that day, Margaret surprised Maya with a request. "I want to take a walk," she said, her voice firm despite her frailty. Maya hesitated. "Are you sure? You've been so tired." "I'm sure," Margaret interrupted. "There's something I want to show you." Chris helped Margaret into a lightweight wheelchair, and the three of them set off down the quiet neighborhood street. Margaret directed them toward a small park at the edge of town, her face lighting up as they reached a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. "This is where your father proposed to me," Margaret said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Right here, under this tree." Maya glanced around, taking in the serene beauty of the park. "I didn't know that." Margaret smiled wistfully. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Maya. About my life, my choices. But I want you to know now. I want to share it all with you." Maya knelt beside her mother, her hand resting on Margaret's arm. "I want to know, Mom. I want to understand." Margaret's smile widened, her eyes shining with hope. "Then we'll start here, and we'll take it one step at a time." As they sat beneath the oak tree, the sun filtering through the leaves, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey toward reconciliation was far from over, but for the first time, she felt truly connected to her mother, and to the legacy of resilience and love that bound them together. A mother's legacy. The days passed in a delicate rhythm, each moment a chance for Maya and Margaret to rebuild the relationship that had been strained for so many years. Maya found herself rediscovering not only her mother, but also the strength and resolve that had always defined Margaret Henderson. It wasn't just in the stories Margaret told, but in the quiet pride that radiated from her as she showed Maya the legacy she had built within the community. It was on one such day that Margaret surprised Maya with another request. They were sitting in the living room, the faint scent of lavender lingering as the afternoon sun bathed the space in golden light. Margaret looked at Maya, her expression serious yet warm. "There's something I want you to see," she said, her voice steady despite the weariness in her frame. "It's time I showed you the work I've been doing, the part of me I've never really shared with you." Maya raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Margaret smiled faintly, her fingers brushing against the armrest of her chair. "You've seen the community center, but you haven't seen the heart of it, the people who truly carry on the fight." That evening, they drove to a modest building on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much to look at. Faded paint, a slightly crooked sign reading Henderson Empowerment Foundation. But it was alive with activity. Inside, Maya was met with the buzz of voices, the shuffle of papers, and the energy of people dedicated to a cause. The space was small but vibrant, filled with volunteers of all ages working tirelessly at desks and tables. Margaret led Maya inside, her steps slow but purposeful. The room quieted as people noticed her, smiles breaking out across their faces. A young man in his 20s approached, his expression lighting up when he saw Margaret. "Mrs. Henderson," he exclaimed, "we didn't think you'd be by today." Margaret chuckled softly. "I wanted to show my daughter what we've been working on." The young man's gaze shifted to Maya, his smile widening. "You're Maya. Mrs. Henderson talks about you all the time." Maya blinked in surprise. "She does. Non-stop," the young man said with a grin. "She's proud of you." Maya glanced at her mother, who gave her a knowing look. The words warmed her heart, easing some of the lingering doubts she had carried for years. Margaret guided Maya through the space, introducing her to the volunteers and explaining the various projects they were working on: mentorship programs, legal aid for underserved families, workshops on financial literacy. Maya listened intently, her admiration for her mother growing with each passing moment. One corner of the room caught her attention. A bulletin board was covered in photos, news clippings, and handwritten notes. In the center was a large photo of Margaret, her fist raised in the air at a protest, her face alight with determination. "This is your wall," Maya said, her voice filled with awe. Margaret nodded, her expression soft. "It's not just mine. It's the community's. Every success, every step forward, it belongs to all of us." Maya stepped closer, reading some of the notes. One, written in careful handwriting, read, "Mrs. Henderson gave me hope when I thought I had none. Because of her, I'm graduating next month." Another read, "Thank you for fighting for us when no one else would." Tears prickled at Maya's eyes as she turned to her mother. "You've done so much. For so many people." Margaret's gaze was steady. "And so have you, Maya. You just don't see it yet." Later that night, back at the house, Margaret and Maya sat on the porch, the quiet hum of the crickets filling the air. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her frailty more apparent now that the adrenaline of the day had worn off. "I didn't build the foundation for recognition," Margaret said suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "I built it because I had to, because people needed someone to fight for them, and because it gave me a purpose." Maya nodded, her thoughts drifting to her own work. "I've always felt the same way about the FBI. It's not about the badge or the title. It's about the lives I can protect, the justice I can bring." Margaret turned to her, her expression thoughtful. "Do you feel like you've done enough?" The question caught Maya off guard. She stared at her hands, the weight of her mother's words settling over her. "I don't know," she admitted. "There are days when it feels like I've made a difference, but there are also days when it feels like the system is too big, too broken." Margaret reached out, her hand resting on Maya's. "The work we do, it's never enough, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. Every life you touch, every person you help, it matters, even if you don't see the full impact." Maya looked at her mother, her heart swelling with gratitude and admiration. "You've been fighting your whole life, haven't you?" Margaret chuckled softly. "And I don't regret a single moment of it. But Maya, there's something you need to remember." "What's that?" Margaret's eyes softened, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "Fighting for others is important, but don't forget to fight for yourself too. Your dreams, your happiness, they matter just as much as anyone else's." The words hit Maya deeply. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself, to earn her place, that she had rarely stopped to think about what truly made her happy. Her mother's wisdom, hard-earned through years of struggle, felt like a gift she hadn't realized she needed. As the night deepened, Margaret grew tired, and Chris helped her upstairs to bed. Maya remained on the porch, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She stared out at the quiet street, the memories of the day swirling in her mind. Her mother's legacy was undeniable, a testament to the power of resilience and community. But more than that, it was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. One step, one act of kindness, one fight at a time. Maya took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew the road ahead would be challenging. But she also knew she wasn't alone. She carried her mother's strength, her brother's support, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to fight for justice, and to heal the wounds of the past. But tonight, under the quiet stars, Maya allowed herself to simply be, grateful for the family she had, the work she did, and the legacy she was now a part of, a future forged together. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, sunlight spilling over the horizon and painting the town in hues of gold. Maya stood by the kitchen window, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching the world awaken. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and a gentle breeze stirred the curtains. For the first time in years, Maya felt a quiet peace settle over her, a stillness that came from clarity, from connection. Her mother's words from the night before lingered in her mind. "Every life you touch, every person you help, it matters, even if you don't see the full impact." Maya had always believed in her work, but hearing those words from Margaret had struck a chord. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about what the fight meant, about the people whose lives were changed in ways she might never fully understand. Chris walked into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Morning, sis," he said with a yawn, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. "You're up early." Maya smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, studying her. "You've been different since you got here. Lighter, maybe." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Lighter? You mean exhausted?" Chris chuckled. "No, I mean, it's like you're finally letting go of something. Like you're not carrying everything alone anymore." Maya considered his words, realizing he might be right. For so long, she had shouldered the weight of her choices, her successes, and her failures, always feeling like she had to prove herself to her mother, to the world. But being here, reconnecting with her family, had reminded her that she didn't have to bear it all alone. "What about you?" Maya asked, tilting her head. "How are you holding up?" Chris shrugged, his expression softening. "I'm doing okay. It's been hard, watching Mom get weaker, but I'm glad you're here. She needed this. We all did." Maya reached out, squeezing his hand. "I'm sorry I stayed away for so long." Chris shook his head. "You're here now. That's what matters." Later that day, Margaret surprised Maya with another request. She had spent the morning resting, and when she emerged from her room, there was a determination in her eyes that Maya hadn't seen in years. "I want to take a trip," Margaret announced, her voice firm despite her frailty. Maya blinked in surprise. "A trip? Where?" Margaret smiled, her expression wistful. "To the cemetery. There's someone I need to visit." The drive was quiet, the car filled with a sense of reverence as Chris navigated the winding roads. When they arrived at the cemetery, Margaret insisted on walking, her steps slow but resolute as she made her way to a modest gravestone nestled beneath a sprawling oak tree. The headstone bore a simple inscription: James Henderson, beloved husband and father. Maya felt a lump form in her throat as she knelt beside her mother, who rested her hand gently on the stone. "Your father was a good man," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "He fought for this family, for this community, in his own quiet way. He was the one who taught me that strength doesn't always have to be loud." Maya placed her hand on the stone, her chest tightening with the weight of unspoken words. She had been just a teenager when her father passed, his death leaving a void in their family that had never truly been filled. "I think he'd be proud of you," Margaret said, her gaze fixed on the headstone. "Of both of you. He always believed in the power of action, of standing up for what's right. And you've both carried that forward, each in your own way." Maya swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wish he could see us now." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "He can. He always could." That evening, back at the house, Margaret called Maya and Chris into the living room. She was seated in her favorite armchair, a small box resting on her lap. "There's something I want to give you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Maya and Chris exchanged curious glances as they sat on the couch, watching their mother carefully open the box. Inside were a collection of items: a delicate silver locket, a folded piece of paper, and a worn leather-bound journal. Margaret handed the locket to Maya. "Your father gave this to me when we first met. I want you to have it." Maya took the locket, her fingers tracing the intricate design. When she opened it, she found a tiny photo of her parents, young and smiling, their love for each other evident even in the faded image. Next, Margaret unfolded the piece of paper, revealing a handwritten note. She handed it to Chris. "This was your father's last letter to me. I want you to keep it." Chris's hands trembled slightly as he took the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. His voice caught as he read aloud. "No matter what happens, remember that we are stronger together. Our love, our family, it's what carries us through." Finally, Margaret held up the journal. "This is my story. Everything I've done, everything I've fought for. It's all in here. And now it belongs to both of you." Maya took the journal with reverence, the weight of its significance settling over her. "Mom, I don't even know what to say." Margaret smiled, her expression tender. "Just promise me you'll carry it forward. The work, the love, the fight. It's yours now." Maya and Chris both nodded, their hearts full. They knew this wasn't just a gift. It was a passing of the torch, a reminder of the legacy they were now a part of. As the night deepened, the three of them sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and tears. The house felt warmer, the bonds between them stronger than ever. For Maya, the journey home had been more than just a trip. It had been a rediscovery of herself, her family, and the values that defined them. When she finally went to bed, the journal clutched in her hands, Maya felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. Her mother's legacy was now hers to carry, and she was ready to face the future, stronger, wiser, and deeply connected to the family that had always been her foundation.